Good evening. My name is Ellis Dean, and I will be your host from blackdoctor.org. Thank you for joining us for this important community conversation. Tonight, we're talking about a topic that is not only important to our own health, but also for the future of medicine. We're back with another panel in partnership with Cedars-Sinai as we discuss what Black and Brown communities need to know about clinical trials, including why you should participate. Today's discussion is also available via simultaneous interpretation in Spanish on our daily Vitamina Facebook page. We're talking about clinical trials and community of colors because Black patients account for only 5% of clinical trial participants in the United States, while white patients make up the vast majority. Together with our expert panelists, we'll discuss why that is, and most importantly, why we must change that. Let's talk about all of this, but first, let's meet our panel. First, we have Dr. Michael Farku. He is the Associate Dean for Research and Clinical Trials at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. We also have Deneen Prophet-Williams. She is the Executive Director of Clinical Operations and Research at the Samuel Ocean Comprehensive Cancer Center at Cedars-Sinai. And we also have Thibia Richardson, and she is a research administrator at Cedars-Sinai. So I want to say welcome to you all as we show off your beautiful faces to our audience.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, Dr. Farku, let's jump it off right with you. Okay, so clinical trials, we know, have been going on for decades now. We're probably pushing, I would say, safe to say it's centuries. There's always been some sort of clinical trials going on, and they have really been the foundation of modern medicine. But for our viewers, could you help us understand what is a clinical trial and why is it important for the future of medical treatments and the creation of new medications?
Well, thank you for having me. And I think clinical trials are extremely important because they're prospective studies, futuristic studies that evaluate new tests or new interventions. The interventions may be drugs, medications, they may be surgical approaches, or behavioral studies, and all with outcomes that can be measured in human context. Do people feel better? Do they live longer? Do we prevent heart attacks, strokes, cancer-related morbidities and mortality? So clinical trials really are the cornerstone of how we evaluate new diagnostic tests and new therapies.
Fantastic. So we got that part. So Deneen, Why is it important to increase diversity in clinical trials?
Yes, Alice, thanks for having me. As you mentioned earlier, the vast majority of participants are largely white heterosexual males. So we need ethnic, racial, sex, and gender diversity to ensure that the knowledge that we can gain from clinical trials is key to how we progress or make progress against cancer. If we don't have adequate diverse representation in the trial, we can't be sure how those treatments are going to affect people from different backgrounds. So things like genetics, environmental factors, lifestyle, gender, and ethnic origin are all of those things that influence how individuals react to a certain drug.
So, all right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. We all know about the historic kind of mistreatment of Blacks and other people of color when it comes to clinical trials. So we got that. We know what it is. We're going to talk about it. But I guess the question is that the only reason why communities of color are not participating in clinical trials at that appropriate level? And what can organizations, particularly organizations like Cedars-Sinai, do in order to address this?
Yeah,
that's for everybody. So let's start with you, Dr. Farku.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a point that we often get caught up in whether a therapy is effective or not. And in a clinical trial, we call that internal validity. Is the therapy or the test valid? Mm-hmm. And I think we need to talk more around that, because if communities, underrepresented communities, and we know them, the Black community, colored community, indigenous communities, they don't have access to these new therapies and tests. That's really where it starts. Access to the tests in the clinical environment. And that's what we're really aiming to do at Cedars-Sinai is to make our clinical trials available to the entire community around us in Los Angeles and inform practice around the world. And so we need to have folks have access to clinical trials. Then comes the internal validity. Does the test work or does the drug prevent? And, surprisingly, whether we study across different ethnic groups, different races, gender, sex, whatever, we tend to have consistent results there. So although there are examples, for example, in hypertension, where we might treat Black patients differently than Caucasian or white patients, for the most part, the internal validity is there. But where it really falls down is on the external validity. How do we apply the findings? How could we possibly understand how to apply a therapy in underrepresented populations if they're not in the trial? Their diet, their lifestyle, their compliance to medications, their access to care is different. And so we need to understand and study patients that represent the population in general. And that's called generalizability. And it's something we don't do well. I've been involved myself in many NIH, National Institutes of Health studies, in which we have 30% women, not 50%, where we have 2% Black community, not 10%. And so we aim to do this, but we have obstacles. And I'd like us to talk about that. But I'm going to stand back and hear from my colleagues, because I think that's where the rubber hits the floor here. How do we actually overcome this?
Ellis, I also think I agree with Dr. Farku, but I also think that we need to meet people where they are. So before we can discuss access, we have to meet them where they are. And a lot of people of color, particularly those who are in the Black and brown communities, where they are is back in history. The historical context of what it is to be a research participant is significant. And so I think that is very, it's paramount to us wanting to bring these studies to them so that they do have access, but we need to talk about it. We need to discuss it. I think to answer your question, there are a number of barriers that, and my practice of studying research and interacting with research participants, they can list off a number of very significant salient barriers as to why they may or may not participate in research. Some of them are individual. Some of them have to do exactly what, as Dr. Farku said, with access. But a number of them have to do with the systemic mistrust that they have in the healthcare system. And so, and that mistrust comes from, and it's stimulated by the historical context of what took place, but also what is presently happening. There's a number of different studies, and we can talk about a number of different researchers who have discussed the physician and patient communication and things like that, and how do healthcare systems try to ameliorate that eradicate that mistrust amongst patients. I think there's a number of ways in which we can tackle this situation in order to make sure that people who are interested in wanting to be a part of clinical research trials are able to do so.
Yeah, Fabia, you hit on a great point. I think having people of color, people that look like them, that are representative, either both providers or caretakers or caregivers that are treating them, is where we need to go. It's having a pipeline of physicians and scientists of all nationalities that are particularly those that are Black, brown, and indigenous communities are what's important. And so having that familiarity, that relationship, that understanding of African Americans and or those that are Black or brown or indigenous.
Yeah.
So you all said some wonderful things, and Dr. Farku, I want you to continue that thought, but I was like, I just want to kind of recap what I've heard. So they want to be seen, right? So I'm hearing that from you, Dr. Richardson, is they want to be seen, really seen for who they are. They want to see researchers that look like them. So they want to see themselves in the people that are conducting the research and the trials. And from Dr. Farku, they want to have access, right? So we want to be able to provide access to say, yeah, I can see that, but I don't have access to that. And so all of those things were really put into, if they're added more to a clinical trial, I think we could get more participation. It sounds like that's a kind of a rudimentary summary of what I just heard from the three of you. But Dr. Farku, you want to expand on that?
Well, I think it's a wonderful. I'm so pleased to be on this committee because and on this panel, because we're hearing perspectives that are so important. There's a lot of work to do to fix trust, And one of the ways we do it at Cedars-Sinai, which is that we engage the doctor who cares for the patient. Right. It's not like we're doing trials in some other pavilion in a place where, we as researchers come and approach patients. We really engage the caregivers that they do trust. And again, we are making huge strides in the diversity of our faculty and our staff. We need to do better. We need to train the next generation that's diverse and represents the population and underserved populations. So we work on that as well. But in the meantime, I think it's understanding the patient and those that the patient actually has trust in, which is often their attending or ongoing relationships. And that's where it's difficult because, in the clinic, someone's seeing, 5 to 6 patients in an hour, really busy, running a busy practice. We have to make it convenient for them to participate, convenient for the physicians and the staff as well as the patients. And that's where we have integration, and we believe in the integration of our clinical research into our practices, I think is vital.
Absolutely.
If I could just add to what Dr. Farku said, another aspect that I think is very important is that we also need to be linguistically competent, right? And so when we're offering research studies, we can't look at the Black and Brown communities as a monolith. They're not homogenous. There's a number of different languages, including English, but there are a number of other ones that are, the Black community, there's a Haitian Creole, there's other kinds of languages, there's African languages that are spoken, there's other dialects in Spanish as well. So I think that what patients maybe perhaps what usually builds trust, usually with humans, is the ability to be able to communicate very effectively with one another. And so I think that is another aspect of what needs to kind of be looked at when we're trying to encourage populations for whom are not historically represented in clinical trials to kind of encourage them to do so.
That's a very good point. If I could add one thing to that is I think there is some grace that be given for people that are trying, right? That to recognize where their blind spots are, right? So you say, look, I know I can't be linguistically competent for a number of communities, but what I can do is if I engage with somebody, I can say, look, here are my blind spots. I'm learning from you just as much as you're learning from me. And that will go a long way towards bridging that potential communication barrier. And then that will allow that person to give you that grace and say, hey, look, I don't know what I don't know. So please help me understand so I can better serve you. And I think if we do that as healthcare professionals, we'll go a lot farther in terms of really engaging communities that are underserved and underrepresented in these spaces.
That's a great point, Ellis. Through our Center for Health Equity here at Cedars, we're committed to making sure more people in those communities are aware about clinical trials and what the benefits are. So we're constantly tailoring our outreach to certain individual communities and developing those relationships with those community partners so that we can ensure that they have access and that they have an opportunity to have discussions about care and that's important to them, and that they even have access to care, that we're here for them and we're here to treat them.
Ellis, one of the other things we're doing on top of all of this is including patient representatives on our steering committees of trials. Mm-hmm. So when we plan trials, sometimes they're single center conducted at Cedars-Sinai, or they may be multi-center trials. More and more, we're including patients representatives. And it's amazing how, we have the arrogance to say we know what the outcome patients want. But it's amazing. Like, I'm involved in work in diabetes and heart disease, which, I think, preventing a heart attack and stroke, that's pretty important. But when I sat down with a group of diabetes patients and their family members, it was actually blindness and amputation were the two most important issues. And I would never have learned that if I didn't have the patient representatives there planning the trials with us. So that's becoming more and more an important part of how we conduct trials is engagement. And that would also, I think, be more inclusive in terms of representation of the patients and the caregivers and the people conducting the trial coming from their community, I think is vital.
Absolutely. Talking about that diabetic retinopathy, I can talk all about that. But yeah. So, Dr. Farku, we talked about making sure that everyone gets asked to participate in clinical trials, right? Yeah. But here on BlackDoctor.org, we did a survey and we asked a question of our audience, what stopped you from participating in clinical trials? And a good percentage of them said they were never asked. So
exactly,
how can research hospitals like Cedars-Sinai help ensure that communities of color, people that are underserved, underrepresented get asked? And what are some of those systemic changes that are needed in order to make sure that we're asking everybody to participate?
Again, comes some of the arrogance that we have, or the fact that we think we know more than we actually do from the research community. I use that tongue in cheek, but to say that, we say, well, they would not want to be in the study. They wouldn't want to come back and have multiple visits, and they're too busy, or they don't have, the ability to come back to Cedars, right? Because, if they're from the suburbs, we've got to bring the trials to the patients and the follow-up. You have somebody living out in the valley, for them to come in to get a blood test, why don't we go out and to get the blood test? So that's what we're working on at Cedars, is going out and making it more convenient for people to be in a trial. Whereas for some other communities, it's a lot easier. They live in the neighborhood, or they have a lot of accessibility to the institution. And so they come in and get their blood test, they have a coffee and they go home, or, so that's part of it is the idea that we think we know what people want, and we may not even approach them. At Cedars, at Cedars-Sinai, I think we really commit ourselves to having every patient considered to study them in some way, to learn more about that patient. And it's in our DNA. And I think it comes from the community background from which, Cedars-Sinai arose. Mm-hmm. It is, there are people that were born here, lived their entire life, cared for here, died here, the families have all come here. And so that's sort of in our DNA and in the tradition of Cedars-Sinai. And so I would like to think that we approach everyone, but there are obstacles. They're caregivers themselves. Will they actually, we make the assumption that they don't want to be in the trial and they don't want to participate in the follow-up, is what I'm saying. And I don't think we should be so bold to do that. We should approach everyone.
Absolutely. I think we need to just ask simply when they come to their appointments, have you heard anything about clinical trials? Would you like to know more about clinical trials yes. coming for your appointment? And so we should be having that dialogue and those discussions with patients up front and during the visits and during their return visits. And I want to address something you said, Dr. Farku, about reaching them where they are, or, having those inherent or unconscious biases about, do they want to transport back and forth? We have programs that we work with American Cancer Society or Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, various organizations where we provide transport and support for patients that feel like they can't make the trips or they don't have the funds to make the trips. And we have grants as well as financial programs to help supplement the care and the transportation that they may need.
Yeah.
Another thing that Cedars does, yes, and to also just kind of add to the discussion, another thing that Cedars has done a really great job at, particularly in the clinical trials, is exactly what Dr. Farku has mentioned, is that when a participant or research participant is not able to come back for their follow-up visit, particularly, for instance, to do a single blood test, a number of the studies at Cedars-Sinai have incorporated mobile phlebotomy, which means that they have contracted with an organization that will go to the participants' homes, draw their blood, do whatever follow-up procedure is necessary, and then bring that back to us as researchers, and then we process it, the samples as needed and as required by the protocol. So I think that Cedars does a fantastic job of doing that, because it does meet the patients where they are. And if they do it once and they don't need it again, then that's fine. But we do have the opportunity to be able to do that should they need it, because we want people to be able to feel as if they are, we're including them in the process of the studies.
I think that is a fantastic offering to have, because it's overcoming that obstacle, right? So he's like, they didn't come back, because it slows down a trial, and some trials can end because they don't get enough qualified participants. But if something as simple as having a mobile phlebotomy to go draw that blood keeps that particular participant in the trial, we can keep that trial going and get to what the ultimate result is, which is better outcomes, better treatments, better medications for a participant. It almost feels like this idea. So Dr. Farku, you could take this one. You should get buttons made that says "Ask me about clinical trials" and have the doctors aware when they see the patients.
Yeah. I've actually had worn them a few times.
But yeah, so you had that. All right, so it's not a unique idea, but I think that would be fun, right? It's something that we would see. And I think patients would like, they would seem curious at first, but they understand how important clinical trials is for us. So, Thibia, please tell us about the precautions. So we're talking about the good stuff, but tell us about the precautions and rights that are in place for all clinical trials participants.
There is something called an informed consent process that goes on with clinical trials. And what that allows for, it is a process whereby our institutional review board, our IRB, as we call it at Cedars, and they have them throughout all of the different academic centers that offer clinical trials. They review studies, and in reviewing those studies, they are required to also review the consent forms that potential research participants sign in order to join the study. And so what that does, that is a check and balance, or even a safeguard, if you will, that lets the patients know and can help to reduce their barriers of being fearful of joining a study. That body or that entity is always watching the study. They check out the protocols that the researchers are using to conduct their research, and it's very, very helpful. But I know that the consent process can also be a little bit daunting. And so because of that, we have that check and balance, and allows for patients to feel comfortable knowing that if they do sign a consent form to join a study, that it has been properly vetted by the entity, which is the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board.
Absolutely. So if you're just joining us, and hopefully you've been sticking around, you were there from the beginning, but sometimes people are late. I've been late a few times, but if you're just joining us, we are talking about which is one of our community conversation series in partnership with Cedars-Sinai, and we're talking about clinical trials. And so we have a wonderful panel here really to talk about everything clinical trials. So if you have any questions about clinical trials specifically, I see one from Jose. We're going to get to that at the end of our program. Please put your questions in the comment. We also like to know where people are watching us from. So drop that, where you're watching us from. I saw a lot of folks from LA, so we're good. We're hitting the community
we hope so.
Yeah. in LA, so that is fantastic. So drop your city, rep your city and state in the comments. Any questions? I see we've got some questions coming in from YouTube as well. So keep those questions coming, and we'll ask as many as we can at the end of the program, because this is a two-way street, and we want to get your questions answered. Hopefully we'll answer as much as we can with the presentation. So got to get that off. So we're going to get that. Oh, yep, I see somebody from Texas. All right, great job. Great job. All right, so Dr. Farkoo and Deneen, we're going to share some resources about this in our Facebook chat, right, in the comments. But I want to know, what are some of the questions people should consider before agreeing to take part in a clinical trial? Deneen, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. I think a lot of the questions that most people would have is like, what is the cost to me? Will that be covered by my insurance? Is typically what I hear a lot of working in the clinics. And most of the clinical research trials are either funded by the pharmaceutical company or either the institution. There are some things that are standard of care, and there are some things that may be covered by insurance. So it's going to be dictated by the actual trial that you're on. But those are always good questions to ask. Other good questions are, what are the risks and the benefits of being on a clinical trial? Should I even partake in one? Is, standard of care therapy better for me versus, pursuing a clinical trial? So from that perspective, those are the questions that I hear a lot of here in the clinic.
Yeah, similar questions in my clinics as well, and with our groups. One of the things that comes up, really important, Ellis, is the issue is, what if I don't consent to be in the trial? Will it affect my relationship with my team? Will people be disappointed in me? Will I be letting people down? And I think that's really important, that patients know that sometimes they don't want to be in the trial, or they can't be, they refuse, and it's okay. So the whole idea is that's part of the trusting, right? Is this something that I'm eligible for, but maybe it's not the right time for me. Maybe I have other issues I'm dealing with, and I'll defer that. So they see that it's not influencing their care. That's really important for us at Cedars-Sinai. And the second part of it is, sometimes patients have to terminate their involvement in a trial and they have the right to do that. But what we encourage them is that we follow them for their long-term outcomes, right? That we can have telephone contact with the patient, or if we lose contact with them, if their cell phone expires or they move to Utah or whatever, that we could have a way to reach them. That's really important because we want to learn about every patient and their outcomes. So these are elements of the informed consent, which Tabia and Deneen were talking about, that I think are really important, that it is a partnership, and we're not disappointed when people turn it down. We just want to make sure they know that we're thinking about them for the newest and best therapies and diagnostic tests.
Yeah, I think also, and Dr. Richardson, you can kind of talk about this too, is one of the things, some of the feedback we've gotten is people being afraid that their information is going to, or their decisions or their behaviors are going to be weaponized against them, right? And I think that's what you're kind of alluding to, Dr. Farku, is saying, okay, I don't participate, and now all of a sudden, or if I stop participating,
exactly.
I'm persona non grata with my healthcare provider, and nobody wants to have that, right? It's particularly with their healthcare.
Right.
So yeah, that's a big piece.
It is a big piece, and I would like anyone to know who's interested in joining a clinical trial. We do what we do at Cedars, and I know they do it at other places as well, is that we repeat several times about the confidentiality aspect of someone wanting to join a study. Because we're in healthcare, we guide ourselves under HIPAA, and so with HIPAA, we're not able to just go and tell about people's medical care. Very similarly, we're not able to talk about their research care. I have studies right now where we have different blood kits that we send to different clinics, and even the clinic staff doesn't know that particular participant is a research participant versus someone who's just coming in for standard of care. And so I give that example to just show how seriously and how committed we are at Cedars to ensuring the confidentiality of participants once they have given us the gift of their time and of wanting to be be in our research studies.
I love that you called it a gift, because we only got 24 hours in a day. So if we're giving some of that to you, it is a gift. Yes. So Dr. Farku and Deneen, how can people find out if they are eligible for a clinical trial? Are they only for people who are sick and not responding to treatment, or are they for healthy people too?
Absolutely. People that are healthy. I've actually participated in a clinical trial myself. So in the past. And so there are opportunities out there for you to participate in well-being clinical trials. There's opportunity for you to participate in those clinical trials where there may be disease progression or diagnosis. So I think there's a wealth of opportunity for both the healthy aspect as well as, for disease progression. But I'll turn it over to Dr. Farku.
Yeah, I try to think of these trials in two buckets. One is the patients that are sick and for which we need new therapies. We need them drastically. Particularly, I'm not a cancer doc, but I understand the cancer field very well. We've learned so much from cancer researchers and patients about their willingness to participate in trials, their eagerness to find a therapy that could prolong their life or give them higher quality of life. So that's really, 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 really important. And so that we call that more treatment of disease. More and more we have trials and studies of primary prevention where people are not sick. They don't have dementia or disability or heart disease, and we're trying to prevent it from developing. And I think those are interesting trials. The challenge in those trials is follow-up is long. It's not like we can do a trial in 30 days or 3 months. We have a study in Framingham, Massachusetts, which unfortunately is not a diverse population, but they have studied now 4 generations of families. And that's where we actually learned about the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, hypertension, cholesterol. We learned that from Framingham. And so these families have participated for generations, and we've learned so much, but we need the long run there. And that's where, we need to engage the communities to be involved. It may even go to the churches and synagogues and, houses of worship, to community centers, to VA, centers. We had at Cedars a very well-known barbershop study where we studied high blood pressure therapies in barbershops and engaged people. And we have extremely high retention rates for these primary prevention studies. So, I think we need to, not one size fits all is what I would say.
Well, I tell you, if you're doing a hypertension study, you might want to go to Roscoe's and set up a center there. I'm sure you can find some participants there. Yeah. If there's an argument going on at the barbershop, there's probably some hypertension going on, some pressure going up. With some of those sports arguments that happen in the barbershop. So
exactly.
But yeah, so Fabiana, you are a research administrator,
yes,
and you actually enroll patients in clinical trials. So what are some of the common questions or even fears that patients share with you or your colleagues before enrolling in a clinical trial?
I've been told by my staff that some of the fears that they get from patients are, will this make me more sick? How do I know that I'll get the actual treatment and not the placebo?
Yeah,
if I do get the placebo, will I ever get the treatment? Do you know how long this will take? Will my doctor find out that I'm doing it? Some of the studies that we have, the doctors are they're like Dr. Farku said, their attending physician or their primary physician is very much involved in knowing about, because he or she will be the people to introduce the study sometime, but that's not always the case. And so sometimes they say, well, what will my doctor say? Or, how should I do this? Or how am I going to continue the treatment over time? And so there are a number of different fears. How do I know that my name won't be given? We also have, like Deneen mentioned, I don't think that she did it here, but we do have people here at Cedars who are actually staff members who will join studies. Mm-hmm. And so then the question then becomes, because we're an academic hospital, will my supervisor find out? Will my colleagues find out? And so all these questions, all these fears lead right back to what we discussed previously, which is confidentiality. So no matter what the fear is, we can help to dispel it as long as we're able to communicate about it and find out about it. And confidentiality is always at the forefront.
Absolutely.
There is an interesting aspect of clinical trials that has been studied, actually. And it's the issue of whether you're randomized. And what we often do in a clinical trial is flip a coin, and you get either the active new treatment or the usual care, right? That's how we compare whether something is of added value. And what we've shown is actually people who are in the group that gets the placebo or not the new therapy. They're blind. In a placebo trial, you're blinded, but you actually later we found out they were not getting any therapy, any new therapy. They actually have better outcomes because they're in a trial. So that's how I often present this to our patients. I'm a cardiologist, so deal a lot with heart disease and risk factors. And, patients that are studied in a trial actually have better outcomes just by being in the trial. They're followed. They're more adherent to their therapies. They feel supported. Their families are engaged. And so there are positive effects of being in the trial, regardless of what you're randomized to, as Tabia pointed out, because, our patients say, I'll be in the trial if you give me the active therapy. I'm not going to be in the trial if you give me placebo. But of course, that's the whole point of the trial, right? We don't know what patients get often when they're in a placebo-controlled trial.
Right. You're absolutely right, Dr. Farku. We see that oftentimes. They're very engaged. They're willing. They show up to their appointments.
Yes.
They have family support, which is, phenomenal. I can't speak enough about the familial support that it takes to ensure that they actually make their appointments and that they get here. So absolutely, I couldn't speak enough about that in the clinic.
That's called the power of hope for us lay people.
Yes.
So
power of hope.
And it's very powerful. So they believe that they don't know what they're getting, but they believe they're getting and they're engaged. And so that overall hopeful feeling about their condition improves, and that can improve their overall outcome even without getting the newer treatment. So that is fantastic. So that's a good thing for our audience to know, to understand that even if you're not getting the control, you might be part of that control group that they're testing against. just by participating in that clinical trial, your outcomes are going to improve. And then I believe, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe after the trial is completed, they offer, if you were in that placebo group, they do offer, if that if that treatment was successful, they offer it to you to participate. So
it can be part of the trial, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, and of course, if we find that something it meets the standard of the FDA for approval, then the patients most likely to receive it are going to be the patients who were already in the trial who didn't receive the therapy. But there are extended trials now. We extend trials where we cross the folks over and we look at, well, what was the effect of getting the therapy 3 years earlier versus 3 years later? And there's some interesting findings there in prevention as well.
Wow. So, Dr. Richardson, we talk about clinical trials a lot here at blackdoctor.org. And, you know, for example, I do a monthly show called Clinical Trials in Black Folks right here. And one thing patients tell us is the process to enroll can be overwhelming. I liken it to signing a mortgage, but not everybody has signed a mortgage. So I understand that that's not quite a clear example, but they tell us it's a lot of paperwork and consent forms. So can you help dispel some of the confusions and fears around the process of enrolling in a clinical trial, and what can potential participants expect?
Sure. So I do agree. I have also heard patients say that it takes a lot to be consented into a study. They're dependent upon the disease that that's under study. There could be a couple of pages of a consent form to a whole booklet of a consent form, depending upon what the disease is. And so what I would tell a potential participant of a research study is that, you know, please be patient with us. Our job, in particular what we do at Cedars, is that our job is to ensure that you know every single thing possible, the benefits, the risks, the objectives of the study, everything that you can think of about the study. And so it does take a little time, and that could also contribute to the feeling of being overwhelmed, because we go page by page. We're not gonna skip over anything, because we want to make sure that they are fully aware. Part of why we do that is because I think that when we're a bit transparent like that, it bolsters trust. You know, we will go through every single thing. We will stop and ask them, do they have questions? And so it can be overwhelming. The other thing I would like for potential research participants to also know is that perhaps some of that feeling of being overwhelmed is because of where you are. You know, a lot of times the patients are they are in an actual physician appointment where they may have been told about a diagnosis that they just received or something that they've been trying to manage. And that alone is overwhelming. So, and then we come in with this big encyclopedia, like piece of paper or pieces of paper saying that we're going to consent them to a study. And so I would just say that, you know, please be patient, and it's really we're there to protect you. And that's why it's overwhelming. We're going over everything that we can.
As a follow-up, how do you overcome that kind of belief that you say, hey, I'm going to enroll you in this clinical trial, that could land on somebody like, oh, y'all don't know how to treat this, right? You know, because you're like, well, we got this great clinical trial that's going to help you with your condition. You're like, wait. I came to you to be treated, and now you're going to enroll me in a clinical trial. That could send the message that they don't know how to treat this. So how do we overcome that potential objection?
Well, you know, we actually instead of making it a statement, we make it a question. And so we say, would you like to learn about the clinical trials that we have available for you? And so I think with that kind of, it's a better way to approach a patient, you know, and so then they decide whether they want to be in the study, and then we can have a discussion about it. I think that to make the statement, we presume that they are already going to say yes, and automatically that puts people at a defense. And so our job is to make sure that they feel as comfortable as possible, particularly when we're offering things like clinical trials.
That's called the assumptive close in sales. Like you just, so it's like when you go to buy that car dealership, they are just assuming that you're going to buy that car. They start making assumptions. And so in this space, having that assumptive close position is not quite the best thing to do. Bring them along in the process slowly, answer all their questions, go through page by page. It is a process, people, but I promise you it'll be worth it in the end.
And I was just going to say, and I think sometimes you have to, again, as Thibia said, you have to meet them where they are. If they're not ready to hear that information at that moment in time, they may need to process that information about their diagnosis And at the next visit, that may be the more appropriate time to be able to discuss that information, where they have, they can now begin to process and receive, and they can begin to ask more questions and have a better understanding about what we're presenting with the clinical trial. So it doesn't always have to be immediate. It could be a little further down the line, but just know that it's available to them.
And we also offer them the ability to take the consent form with them home.
Yes.
I think that is very, very helpful. Yes. They don't have to sign it, as Deneen said. It's not required that they sign it right then and there when we offer the study to them or introduce the study to them. They're able to take it home. They're able to talk. They're able to read it at their leisure. They're able to talk it over with their loved ones. They're able to think about it. And then, like she said, at their next follow-up, or even a coordinator may call them several days later just to check on them, to let them know that we just didn't give this to you and forgot about you, but we actually gave it to you with the interest of just seeing whether you want to participate or not. So I think that all of that kind of builds trust and confidence in what the process that we're trying to do is, which is trying to allow them the ability to join the study.
Absolutely. Yeah, we believe in team medicine, and one of the challenges is that you can see a given patient, if they have diabetes, high blood pressure, atrial fibrillation, they could be approached for 5 different trials, five different teams. And that's why at Cedars-Sinai, we like to integrate within the practice with the doctors, because doctors are going to say, look, they just got asked to be in another trial. They're going to think something's wrong with us because we just keep coming with trials on patients. So we have to be very sensitive about that. And we're working extremely hard to integrate our coordinators and folks so let's say I go to see a patient and they don't have diabetes, so they wouldn't be in my trial in heart disease. I might call my colleague and say, well, they had atrial fibrillation. So, this is a patient that might be eligible for one of your trials. It's kind of the integration of trials into our practice. The research is not separate from our practice.
Right.
Every patient that's in a clinical trial at Cedars-Sinai is also in our practice, right? So we have that standard, and I think that's where we will excel. And we will continue to inform others because, we're a tertiary referral center. We get patients from all over coming into and complex patients. So we have to be sensitive to that too in our eagerness to solve new problems.
Right.
Absolutely. So when it comes to increasing participation in clinical trials among people of color, how important is it to have more researchers from diverse communities? Or Dr. Farco, yes, please.
Yeah, is leading the charge here at Cedars with my colleagues, department chairs and institute heads. We are committed to diversity. I think we like to coin it inclusive excellence, right? We believe in excellence, but we believe in inclusiveness. And it's how we train the next generation and identify and have opportunities for folks to enter research careers in teaching hospitals. And so this is vital. We're working extremely hard on that. We have a very strong group on diversity and equity in our hospital, led by Sarah Kilpatrick and her group. And we have so many folks that are engaged in this. We're committed to it because we believe that this inclusiveness makes us better and also allows us to have folks who are representative of the population and treating and managing patients who are like them. Patients, as we've learned today, they're more likely perhaps to enroll in a study, or if the doctors and the community are from their own community. And I think that that's part of where medicine is heading. We've been long behind, both on the sex and gender level, but also on representative minorities, visible minorities. Mm-hmm. And so we've spent the last few years really refocusing. We've got a long way to go, but I think there's a pipeline, and we've got to feed the pipeline. It starts in high school, getting folks interested in careers in science, medicine, how we accept folks into medical school it's somewhat, there's an imbalance there about who gets into school, who has access to it. It's all about accessibility. Right. And so we're working on that. And I think it will improve our patient care in the end.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Farku. When you have people with different contexts that are working together, their unique perspectives often lead to greater creativity. And it really helps them develop new perspectives and approaches to the work environment and or research. So it could be applicable to anything, but I think truly having people from diverse backgrounds and having that equity and inclusion is really what continues to push the needle in terms of our healthcare delivery system.
I also agree. I think that the idea of having inclusive excellence, I like that term, Dr. Farku. I think that's fantastic. I think when we think about that, that inclusive excellence allows for everyone to have a seat at the table. It's just not those for whom we are trying to enroll in the study, but it's those for whom are also involved in creating the studies. I think that inclusive excellence allows for us, as Deneen mentioned, to be able to offer cultural competence that may be thought of or not even thought of as cultural competence, so to speak. If I'm sitting at the table as a researcher, my life experience is going to come into play, and I'm going to also maybe perhaps put that into the inclusion criteria that may allow for people of the Black and Brown community to be able to be in the study, because the inclusion criteria kind of leads to that direction. That is what I consider inclusive excellence. When there's no one at the table to even begin with the studies, it's hard to kind of get that down the pike. So as Dr. Farku said, the pipeline is very, very important, and where we interject that inclusive excellence is as well as important as the pipeline.
Absolutely.
Well, my grandmother used to say all the time, I can see better than I can hear. And so
exactly.
Seeing people that look like you in these programs, it will go a long way in terms of getting more people of color involved, because they're seeing the actual, instead of, because we can write a lot of things, we can say a lot of things, but I need to see the actions. And so when you see those actions, when I see Dr. Richardson and Deneen here on this talking about it and what they're doing every day, it gives me some comfort to know that Cedars is on the right track in terms of putting actions behind the words. And so I appreciate that from all of you. So we're going to we got one final question, and then we're going to get to, so we got a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. So I want to ask you, for someone watching tonight who wants to help advance science and is open to participating in clinical trial, what can they do tonight or tomorrow to start that process? Who should they talk to? Where should they go for more information? What can we do?
I would say initially, if you're coming into the hospital or you're seeing your physician, talk to your physician. That's the number one thing. Talk to your physician. Ask them about your clinical options, availability, and having that candid, open, honest discussion with your provider is really what's key, because they will, hopefully guide you in the right direction for your diagnosis, for you, for what you're experiencing at that point in time. So having open, honest conversation, I would say, would be key.
I agree with that, Deneen. I think another option that a potential person who's interested in joining a research study could do is they can access the internet and go to clinicaltrials.gov. On that website, there's a number of different trials based upon different diseases or different ailments that people are managing. And so I think that is another way, in addition to talking directly with their providers.
Absolutely. I believe that I look at it a little bit differently. I agree with everything. We have a robust website at Cedars-Sinai that catalogs our clinical trials, and each of our departments describes, our activities quite well. Mm-hmm. And it is one way to access it. For patients that are relatively healthy, who aren't sick, who may not have a healthcare provider or see them on a regular basis, we have to go out to the communities too. And I think that builds trust. The community centers, gyms, barbershops, as we talked about, we need to go out to the community and educate folks about clinical trials. And, we do advertise trials for prevention in those kinds of settings. And I think that's good, because people can, I've been in the grocery store and seen, a couple of posters for clinical trials for prevention and behavioral studies, and sometimes, you know, young folks with mental illness and other challenges, you know, they're receptive to that. So I think we need to have a broad attack on this. I think it's got to be a force beyond just what we think about in front of us, like, you know, the websites and the physicians. We've got to go out to the communities.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a little bit of time to answer some audience questions, and so I'm just going to throw a couple that we have at you in a little bit of time that we have left here. So this one is coming from Jose, and he is asking, if we were to learn that a close friend or relative was newly diagnosed with cancer and they expressed concern of participating in a trial referred to them by the provider, what would be the first thing you offer or say to that friend or relative to begin addressing their concern? Deneen, you're in the cancer center.
Absolutely. I think just having that conversation with them, like being a support system, you know, let me go with you. Let me be your advocate or your resource. And then patient may not even think about that at that point in time. That may not be where their head is at that moment. So having that additional support person, if the patient is willing to have you to come with them, and you can be that person. Are there clinical trials or other treatments or therapies that are, you know, would be beneficial, or that, you know, my family member or relative would qualify for? So having that advocate or that person to be that support for the patient would be helpful.
That's a good point. All right. So we've got another one here from YouTube from Vonzetta Kane. And she's asking, should an individual be interested in participating in a specific type of research study? How would they contact that specific department? So if, like, you're saying, hey, I want to participate in this specific study, can they contact the department directly, or is there like a triage, for lack of a better term, for all the clinical trials at Cedars-Sinai?
As Dr. Farku mentioned, each of the departments at Cedars-Sinai kind of have a listing of their clinical trials that they are offering. And usually they have numbers, like general contact numbers, that the potential participants can access, and then they usually will be forwarded to us. I have a number of calls every week from different patients who are interested in studies that are pulmonary and critical care, and they filter them to myself or people on my staff. And so there's always a contact number that is offered. They can get in touch, that they could talk to us.
Just to add, I think it's the clinicaltrials.cedarsinai.edu site, and it will list by disease all of the clinical trials that are available by site or by disease there, and you can click and find more information. And then there's, again, a contact down at the bottom.
That's great.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I've got it showing on the screen, and I've also dropped that in the comment section. So if you want to
yeah, Alice, also many clinical trials have their own website for the trial. Mm-hmm. And so if often, you know, I get called from patients in Cleveland or, you know, New York, and they want to be in a trial. And so we often connect them with colleagues there as well. And we have a very collegial community of clinical trialists. I would say it's sort of a sisterhood, brotherhood situation. And so we work together. And that's why we think of it very much of the integration of our trials into our practice. Mm-hmm. Just like if I had a patient who had cancer in Atlanta, I would, you know, call my colleagues there and try to find out who was the best person. So a lot of it is just reaching out, and people will help. I think we're altruistic that way.
Absolutely. And so I think also, if I could blow our own horn here at blackdoctor.org, we also have a clinical trials resource center on our website. And so if you just go to blackdoctor.org and click on the resource center, there's a drop-down box, and you can click on clinical trials and learn more about clinical trials, what we're just talking about tonight. We'll have this video there so you can watch videos. There's a number of resources on there, clips and whatnot, to really kind of help our audience become more familiarized and more comfortable with clinical trials, learn more about it, and that hopefully that will help bridge that gap between understanding information and engagement, because we're really trying to move in anything. I was a former counselor, and so one of the things I try to help my clients is develop insight about their behavior, but what was most important is get them to act and make the changes. And so we're trying to, and same thing with clinical trials. We're giving them information and insights about clinical trials, but what's most important for people to walk away with is the actual action, and that's moving it to and getting involved in clinical trials, because that's where the most you can make the most difference, not just knowing about them, but actually participating. So I think that's a real important point to make. So wow, this has been a fun hour. So as we're wrapping up here, I'm going to give everybody a chance to give their final thoughts. What do you want people to know as they're leaving this program? If there's one thing you want people to remember, what do you want them to walk away from this program knowing? We'll start with you, Dr. Richardson.
I think what I would like people to walk away from the program knowing is that should you decide that you're interested in joining a clinical trial, please know that your confidentiality is always kept, and that it's important for you to ask questions, particularly during the informed consent process. And that it's a voluntary process, and that at any time you can also determine whether you want to continue with the study or not. But you are in the driver's seat as the patient and as the person who is going to be joining the research study. So I want them to always feel empowered to ask questions and to know that that it's possible to join the study as long as they have the interest to do so.
Absolutely. Deneen?
Yes, for me, I think it is, we really need more people of Black and Brown ethnic origin to sign up for clinical trials. If there's an opportunity, or if you see there's a need for you in terms of what you're going through and disease, have that question, have that conversation with your healthcare provider, because we're here to support you and provide you with the best care possible. And we want to be able to offer the best care for future generations. And we can only do that by having diverse partners in clinical trials.
And I would say, take it the next angle, which is we're grateful for our patients and for those subjects that enroll in clinical trials. The gratitude is not often expressed, but I always am impressed when trials are presented and they thank the patients. And they thank the people that were enrolled and their families, because it really is paying it forward. And I say that because it is voluntary, and it is based on generosity of spirit. But remember the following: whatever we do in a trial, it's on the top of the best therapy we have at Cedars-Sinai. So we're giving you the option to have a new test or a new therapy. But remember, it's on the best care that we can possibly give. And so we hope that you're in good hands.
Well, absolutely. We were in some great hands tonight, and we've got some wonderful information. Unfortunately, an hour seems long, sometimes an hour is long, sometimes an hour is short. Tonight, it felt short. So I want to just thanks again to our partners at Cedars-Sinai for this informative discussion. Thank you, Dr. Michael Farku, Deneen Prophet-Williams, and Dr. Tabia Richardson for joining us today and for sharing so much information. Remember, diversity in clinical trials is not only important to our individual health, but also to the future of medicine. We hope you learned a lot tonight about why it is important for you to participate in clinical trials. Thanks again to our friends at Cedars-Sinai and to all of our viewers. From all of us here at blackdoctor.org and Daily Vitamina, have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you very much.